Hi, my name is Paula. I'm from NVIDIA, and here with me today is Quentin from Massive Entertainment, Ubisoft. And we have a very exciting talk today. We're going to talk about the magic behind ray traced lighting in Star Wars Outlaws. Let's go. Why isn't this doing anything? Okay, better. So basically, Star Wars Outlaws, we as NVIDIA collaborated with Massive and Ubisoft on this title, so that's why both of us are here today to talk about it. But let's first talk a little bit about the game, because you all might not be aware what it is and how it works and what's the environment and so on. So Star Wars Outlaws, it is an open world action-adventure game in the Star Wars universe. There's 4 different planets, drastically different environments. I'm going to show you later small trailers, or you'll understand the environment a little bit more, and for example, the lighting conditions and whatnot. It was released in last August, and it was developed in Snowdrop engine. And a little bit about Snowdrop engine. It is Ubisoft's internal engine. It was developed originally for Tom Clancy's Division in 2016. And ray tracing was added for that engine for the Avatar Frontiers of Pandora in 2023. But okay, let's look at the trailer.
Yeah. It does.
All right, as you can see, there's all kinds of different environments. There's indoors, outdoors, foliage, all kinds of stuff. So that requires quite a lot from the lighting. So that's why we needed to add a few or 2 different technologies to this engine. And those key technologies that we're also going to talk today about are ray traced direct lighting, RTXDI in short, and that is using RTXDI Dynamic Illumination SDK. And the point of the SDK is that, at least in theory, you could trace up to millions of light and get this very realistic and nice looking lighting. And the other key, I needed to mention that Quentin's gonna talk about RTXDI in a bit. And then later, I will be talking about the other key technology, which is DLSS Ray Reconstruction. That is a AI-based technology for denoising ray traced images and elevating the image quality. But now I will give the turn for Quentin to talk about RTXDI.
All right. Let's talk about RTXDI. So some quick background first. The Snowdrop engine includes several ray tracing features that are at the core of the engine. We have ray traced global illumination, ray traced reflection, ray traced sun distance shadows, and ray traced audio. For the reflection and global illumination part, I gave a presentation at last year GDC if you are interested. And for the ray traced audio part, my colleague will give a talk this Friday. So based on that, adding a new ray tracing feature shouldn't be too hard, right? Okay. So the RTXDI SDK include a good implementation guide on how to set up everything. So I won't go into all the details on how that works, but I will skim through our implementation and give you some small step-by-step guide. So the implementation was actually quite fairly straightforward, and it took us 2 to 4 weeks to get something working in the engine. We started by adding the initial sampling and final shading of the RTXDI, then adding the restore spatial resampling, then the restore temporal resampling, then adding denoising, plugging everything into the engine nicely, and enjoy some nice ray traced lighting. Going into a bit more details, here's how everything fits in the frame. We start with the prepare task that runs in parallel with a bunch of other prepare tasks on the CPU, and its goal is to prepare all the RTXDI data on the CPU and make them ready for the GPU. Then we have the update task, where we will update all the relevant GPU data on graphics compute queue. And finally, we have the render task that will run on the graphics queue, and this is where all the RTXDI magic will happen. For the next few slides, I will go fairly quickly. I won't go into all the details, but give you a small guide on how to implement everything. So for the initial sampling and final shading, the prepare task, fairly easy. You just gather all the URL lights that needs to be run in RTXDI, generate all the data necessary, and you're good to go. For the update task, simply upload your light buffer. And the render task, simply call your initial sampling shader that will create the reservoir, and the final shading shader that will ray trace the lights and do the final lighting computation. And this is what we get with 8 initial sample. Only 1 is chosen and actually ray traced. So you can see that we get an overall lighting, but it is quite noisy still. So to help with the noise, we can add special resampling. The prepare task, nothing to change here. The update task, we need this neighbor offset buffer that will be used in the special resampling process. We need to create that, generate the data for that, and upload it. And for the render task, simply dispatch your special resampling shader, and it will perform the magic for you. And this is again what we get with the initial sampling. This is what we get with special resampling. So if I go back and forth, you can see that we get a cleaner image, but it's obviously still quite noisy. To help the noise further, we can add temporal resampling. For the temporal resampling, the prepare task becomes a bit more involved. Indeed, we need to track the state of the light on the previous frame and the current frame to be able to perform the temporal resampling. So for that, we track where in the light buffer we place each light, and on the CPU we use a hash map to know where that is. But here's a quick example on how that looks. So we have the light buffer. With the first part of the light buffer, we store lights in the odd frame, and the second half we store the light for the even frames. And then we have the light index mapping buffer that will map those index from the odd frame to the even frame and even frame to the odd frame. So a quick example for the light 0, it's at index 0 in the odd frame, but then it is index 128 for the even part, so we map that way. Light 1 doesn't exist in the even frame, so we put -1, and light 2 is at 128, so we put 128, and the same for the even frame part. For the update task, nothing too complicated here. We simply need to upload the light buffer, the light index mapping buffer, and then update the light buffer part that corresponds to the current frame. And finally, for the render task, we simply dispatch the temporal resampling shader, and that will do the temporal resampling. So this is what we get with the special resampling, and this is what we get with temporal resampling. So you can clearly see that we get rid of most of the noise. If you look clear, in some places we still get noise, especially in an area where there's multiple lights fighting for contribution, or in some part where temporal accumulation or temporal resampling is not as possible. So to clean that up more, we can use denoising. I won't go into any detail there, but we are using NRD Relax, and there is a good implementation guide on GitHub as well, and as well in the sample application of RTXDI. And this is what we get with denoising, so a fairly clean image that is clearly usable for our game. One small caveat with denoising is that it relies a lot on temporal accumulation, which can lead to a lot of ghosting when we have moving shadows and moving lights. Thankfully, Relax allows us to feed it a confidence input that can better inform the temporal accumulation. So if we have low confidence, we do less temporal accumulation than if we have high confidence. I won't go into details on how we can calculate that confidence input, but basically we check how the luminance change over frame and use the reservoir information for that as well. And here's an example. So this is RTXDI off. We have sharp shadows, which is not that nice. with RTXDI on, we get some soft shadows, but obviously we get all the ghosting and we don't see the fan anymore. And here with the confidence input, we get the fan back with a little bit more noise in some of those areas where we get less temporal accumulation. So I just let the video run one more time. All right, so when we plug everything together, all the lighting, this is what we get. Well, actually, I'm lying to you. At that stage of the implementation, this is what we get. So if you don't see the difference, I can go back and forth. You'll notice that the droid on the right of K loses its shadows. If you look closely, the NPC also loses their shadows. And if you look far back, the just left shoulder of K, you can see that there is a net that is casting net looking shadow here. But here it's casting like complete shadow. So what's happening there? The main issue is that the BVH that we have for our current ray tracing features, so ray trace global illumination and ray trace reflection, is quite coarse. We generally don't have small meshes in it. We use a fixed LOD for everything. We don't use skinned meshes or vertex displacement except for K and Nix that are our main characters. And we don't have any accurate alpha testing. And obviously, for nice shadows, RTXDI will need all of that to be nice and accurate. As I note, if you are interested in how our coarse BVH works, you can watch that great GDC presentation my colleague gave last year. So, as all games, Star Wars Outlaws world are full of NPCs and objects using vertical modifiers, such as all the grass flowing in that picture. So while we need all of that to be included in our BVH for RTXDI and to be updated frequently to get all the nice shadow moving accordingly, it would be unrealistic performance-wise to update everything at every frame. So we need to restrict what we can get updated at each frame. So firstly, we restrict using variable LODs and refitting of instances, so updating instances for instances that are inside an extended first term and within a certain radius of the camera. Everything outside of that will fall back on our coarse BLAS that we already have. Secondly, we restrict the number of new BLASes we can generate per frame to up to 200. And thirdly, we restrict the number of refit that we can have for instances up to 1,000 instances per frame. So for our LODs, in SoundUp, our meshes can have up to 4 LODs. So at every frame, each instances of those meshes can have any of those 4 LODs. So if the needed LODs for the current mesh doesn't have a BLAS yet, we simply request the BLAS to be generated. And if we already have too many BLAS requests, so max 200 per frame, this frame we will simply fall back to another existing LOD that we have, and if we don't have another LOD existing yet, we simply won't be adding that instance to the BVH this frame, but we will try again next frame. For instance refitting, we sort all instances that need it into 3 priorities. We have the high priority, which is maximum 150 meshes within 5 meters. Then we have medium priorities, everything else within 25 meters. And then low priority, which is everything else remaining everywhere. So we only update 1,000 of those instances per frame, which guarantee all high priorities instance to be updated. For the refit process, we basically run a compute shader that mimic what the vertex shader is doing and simply output the modified vertex position into a buffer. And then we use that buffer to refit the BLAS of that instance. So as you imagine, it means that every instances of the same mesh, like every blade of grass, is animated independently. So every one of those will need a new BLAS, a unique BLAS, and also all of those will need all those 4 LODs at some point or another. So this can be a really big strain on VRAM usage, so we've put in place a hard limit on the number of unique billaces we can have per sector for those procedurally placed instances such as grass, which is 768 maximum billaces that you can have. For alpha testing, every shader that we have is created by our artists, and they can use anything as alpha values. They can use textures or any procedural effect that they want, and alpha value can come from world position, noise, whatever. Therefore, we don't necessarily have an alpha texture that is ready to be used for our ray tracing pipeline. So our solution is to generate an alpha texture based on the shader graph that we have. So for that, we store a cache for every material and meshes using alpha testing, as well as the alpha texture that we may already have generated. And every frame, we check for every cached material, which map we would ideally need for the texture. If that map already exists, that's fine, we can just reuse it. Otherwise, we will rasterize the mesh in UV space to generate that alpha texture. So it means that in the vertex shader, we output the UV coordinate of each vertices as the clip position, and we will output the alpha value in the pixel shader. And then we can simply sample the textures during BBH traversal. So here is an example of those birdcage that rely on alpha testing. With our deterred alpha testing that we use in our coarse BBH, it looks like that, so which doesn't look like bird cages. But with our correct alpha testing, this is what we get. And here you have an example of a 256 by 256 alpha texture, which actually corresponds to a 1K by 1K texture because we store only 1 bit of value for alpha value. So either fully opaque, either fully transparent, and we pack that into a RU in16 texture. So here's a quick video to demonstrate the standard or coarse BVH that we have and the RTXDI BVH. So you can see that with the RTXDI BVH, the case model has her hair. She's updating constantly. We also have all the NPCs, and here you can see we don't have grass or don't much of the grass. And with RTXDI, we get all the grass, we get the leaves flowing in the wind, and we get the correct alpha testing for everything. So now that we have RTXDI nicely working, can we do more with it than just using it for our analytical lights? Well, Star Wars Outlaws worlds are full of emissive meshes, and those are being picked up by the RTGI and RT reflection, and they can become a primary source of lighting in some scenes. As an example, this Imperial Hangar, if I disable global illumination and reflection, this is what we get. So this is only analytical lights, and you can clearly see that the lighting is totally different. We lose all the overall lighting that we get from the ray tracing, indirect ray tracing. So since RTXDI can support any kind of shape of light, including triangle light, and the number of light is not as much as a constraint as traditional deferred lighting technique, we could add all those triangle lights to RTXDI as a light source. And this is what we get. This is only a debug view of lighting. There is no indirect lighting here, and we get all those triangles lighting the scene. In that particular scene, we have 18 million triangles, which is quite a lot, even too many. So while RTXDI can handle a lot of lights, having a million of them is not optimal, because the more light we have, the harder it will be for the algorithm to pick a good sample and run with it and get good clean result at the end. So we could increase the number of light samples that we get. So as an example, here is an image with one initial light sample. It takes 1 millisecond to run the initial sampling shader here. It's quite noisy, even with the temporal and spatial resampling. This is denoising disabled by the way, but the denoising won't do a good job with that. If we do 8 initial sampling, it gets better, but still quite noisy and not really usable. With 32, quite good already, but still could be noisy. And with 128 initial sample, much better. But you may have seen that it also takes now 7 milliseconds to run the initial sampling, which is not good. So we could help RTXDI to do some by doing some pre-filtering on the triangle lights that we have. So in our case, we can do some pre-filtering based on the distance to the camera for each of those emissive meshes, the size of those emissive meshes, or how bright they are. And if we do that, this is what we would get. We get only 8,000 emissive triangles here, and you can see in the legend the threshold that we use for that particular image. And if I show you the 18 million one, this is 18 million, this is 8,000. So we don't have that much difference, but if you look closely, I don't know if you will be able to see, but we get also way less noise with that version with 8,000 than with the 18 million. But we do lose some of the smaller lights that we have. In that other example, here we have 9 million emissive triangles, and if we reuse those same threshold that were used in the Imperial hangar, this is what we get. So in that case, this is a much more drastic change. So we could get it back to what it looked before. Here we have again 8,000 emissive triangle, but we needed to lower our thresholds. And if we use those thresholds in the Imperial hangar, then we have 38,000 emissive triangles in that hangar. So again, that's not good. So using fixed threshold is not good for every location. It might work in one location, but not in other. So we can have location with way too many emissive triangles and location that wouldn't use as many as they could. So another solution to that problem could be to ask our lovely lighting artists to go over all our location and set some nice threshold. They don't have time for that. They might if we had a small game, but a big open world game that would take way too much time of their precious time. So instead, we should find an automatic and more systematic approach that will use dynamic threshold to update things based on a scene-by-scene basis. And this is what we do. So basically what we are doing is we set a target number of emissive triangle that we want. This is based on the quality setting. So if we are high, we want 2,000. If we are in ultra, 4,000. In max settings, 8,000. Then we have a fixed threshold for the emissive mesh distance that we can pick up stuff. So the further they are, the less important they will become. And then we have 3 dynamic thresholds. The light range is how far the light will have an effect for. The emissive strength is the strength of the emissive brightness. And the mesh radius is the size of the mesh. So at every frame, what we do is we loop over all our emissive meshes that we have. If they are further than the max distance that is allowed, we don't care about them. Then we create a sphere from the mesh radius plus the light range that we have, and we check if that intersects with the camera frustum. If it does not, then those lights won't have any influence in our final seed, so we can discard them. Then we check again all our current dynamic thresholds, so the mesh radius, the emissive brightness, and the light range. If they pass that threshold, we will add that mesh to what we call the new list. And then we do the same, but with the threshold that were used the last time, and we put them in what we call the old list. Then, after we've looped over everything, we will choose the new or the old list that brings us closer to the target that we want without going more than 15% past it in the number of triangles that we have. If we are above the target emissive triangle count, we sort all those meshes by their distance to the camera as well as their emissive brightness. And then we go over that chosen list and we gather all the meshes that we need until we reach the number of triangles that we desire. And then we update our dynamic threshold. So if we are within 10% of our target, we don't change anything that is good enough. Otherwise, we will increase or decrease the threshold based on how far we are from the target. So if we are far below the target, we can decrease the threshold much more to get to the target quicker. And similarly, if we are way above the target, we want to increase the threshold a lot so we can get to the target as fast as possible. And then we keep the threshold that were used previously, or this frame for the next frame as the old threshold. And optionally, we can also only update 1 or 2 threshold per frame. This is useful when we are close to the target. So we just do small baby step toward the target instead of suddenly having 1,000 more triangles if we have 1,000 more triangles that have the same emissive brightness or and similarly close to the camera. So even with pre-filtering the emissive meshes into those 2,000, 8,000 triangle counts, having a lot of light can still be a challenge for RTXDI in some conditions. So ReGear can help with that. This is included in the RTXDI SDK, and again, the sample application provides a good example on how to use it and how to integrate it. But basically, what it does, it segments the world in cells. So here you have an example of like a classic grid cells and an onion mode that is the one that we are using in Star Wars Outlaws. And for each of those cells, it will pre-select a bunch of lights. And then when we do the RTXDI initial sampling, it will select from those pre-selected lights instead of selecting randomly one of those 8,000 lights that we have in the scene. So it allows us to get a good sample, a better sample from the get-go instead of relying more on the temporal and spatial resampling. So some example. So this is RTXDI off, and this is RTXDI on with our emissive triangle target here with 8,000 emissive triangle. So if I can go back and forth, you'll notice the biggest difference is those lights on the wall back there, which are not really being picked up that good with the RTGI and RT reflection, but since we sample them specifically with RTXDI, we get much better response, much more natural fall-off on those lights. And similarly for that example, here it's a bit more subtle, but basically we get a better, more natural response of every of those emissive triangles that we have. So let's finish on sun shadows. So the sun can be added to RTXDI as an infinite light, and it can be sampled specifically. But we found that denoising with relax, we will lose too much details on the normal maps, for example. So therefore, we decided to retrace the sun shadow separately and denoise it with NRD sigma instead. And this is an example of a cascaded shadow map. So I don't know if you will see it on the image, but those thin cable produce classic staircases or aliasing artifacts on the shadows, and the soft shadow is not that accurate here. But when we add the sun into RTXDI, we get nicely accurate soft shadow per pixel, perfect sun shadows, but we also lost all our details in the normal map, or most of the details in the normal map. If I go back and forth, you can see clearly the difference. So if we do the shadow trace separately and denoise with sigma instead, we get our nice perfect sun shadows, pixel perfect sun shadows, but we get back our normal details. So to conclude, the initial implementation for us was fairly quickly and straightforward since we already had some ray tracing in our engine. I would say that 90% of all our lighting setups worked flawlessly. Maybe less than 9% of the lights needed some minor tweaks, and that was mainly lights that were embedded inside objects that needed some tweak to their shadow start values so they don't self-intersect. And maybe less than 1% of the light needed some major change, so reworking the lighting setup, like the shape of the light, the size, the strength, and the placement of the lights. We had to do a big overhaul to our BVH management. This took way more time than needed, than anticipated, but it was needed. There is a huge amount of game content that we have that use vertex modifier, and even things that you wouldn't think are using vertex modifier are using vertex modifier. So for example, we have rock that will sample the height of the terrain to move themselves in vertex shader instead of placing the asset directly where it should be. So those need to be dealt with in GBVH, like everything that use vertex modifier. So as an example, on Toshara, which is a planet with a lot of moving grass and wind, with the coarse BVH that we have, traversing the planet on speeder, we are at about 50 megabytes of VRAM usage for the BVH, and we can pick up to 2.8 gigabytes. And this is mainly because when we move fast on the speeder, there's a lot of new things that needs to be added to the BVH, but there is a lot of old things that are not yet removed because we take some time before removing stuff, so we don't remove, add constantly. But in average, we are about 1 gigabytes when we move at normal speed. And finally, adding emissive meshes to RTXDI can improve the lighting quite dramatically from what we have with our standard RTGI and reflection, and that made our lighting artist quite happy. And to finish, a couple of examples. So this is K shooting a blaster with RTXDI off. The light of the blaster doesn't cast any shadows, and with RTXDI on, it casts shadows, so it makes a big difference there. And another example of a scene that is primarily lit with emissive meshes. This is a little bit more subtle. I don't know if you see on the projector, but we get a bit nicer lighting overall with it. Anyway, that's it for me, and I will pass it to Paula for our stuff.
Great, thanks. Okay, let's talk about DLSS RR. So I'll talk about how it was integrated in Star Wars Outlaws and try to give some general tips as well in case you implement it for your engine. I will not go into details like how this feature actually works internally, but okay, let's go. So first of all, as I mentioned, DLSS RR is for denoising and upscaling and ray traced image in one go. Some of you might be aware of DLSS SR, which stands for super resolution, which is about anti-aliasing and upscaling. And these features share a bunch of similarities. So RR is ideal for games with multiple ray tracing passes. There's no parameters that you need to tune. And you know, it's just easy, it just works. So let's see how it's actually integrated. Oh, sorry, I forgot. I had this motivational image first. So this is the same that Quentin just used. So this is DLSS RR off. So this is one we saw before. And when you enable DLSS RR, you get this. So subtle changes, something that brings up the surface details, going back and forth. Okay, so let's see how this is achieved. So some integration steps. So first thing to do is to disable all the denoising. Like you just remove passes. Who wouldn't like that? And then you make sure that all your ray tracing effects are outputting a noisy signal, which is in uncompressed format, just like floating point 16 RGB. That will do in the rendering resolution. So no half res, no quarter res. I'll explain later why. And then you simply use those noisy buffers. You might have like reflections, global illumination, shadows. You use the noisy buffers as they are and compose the final lighting so that your final lighting image might look something like here. You simply feed that buffer in the DLSS RR pass get it denoised and upscaled, and that's it. So let's see how this looks in the rendering pipeline. So here's an example how Snowdrop's rendering pipeline looks in terms of ray tracing. So first you would have your G-buffer pass, then we would have the RTX DI, DI denoising, ray trace global illumination in quarter resolution, for example, then the denoising, then reflections, for example, in half resolution, and the denoising again. Then we would compose the lighting, then we would upscale, for example, using DLSS SR, then we would do post-processing effects, tone mapping, and we're done. But when you enable DLSS RR, you'll get this. That's much nicer, just much less stuff. That's nice. So now G-buffer, RTXDI, RTGI, reflections, all in the same rendering resolution, and this is important. Then you compose the lighting, then you do DLSS RR, which is upscaling the image and denoising, and then finally your post-processing effects, and that's done. So let's now look into how to actually implement the DLSS RR pass. So this is pretty similar to DLSS SR if you were already familiar with it, but basically these are all the input buffers that you will need, and there would be a few optional ones depending on what you have in your engine. But in Snowdrop, we use this. So there would be this noisy input image, which is the final lighting, then motion vectors, depth buffer, normals and roughness can be together or separate, specular albedo, diffuse albedo, then some optional buffers such as subsurface scattering guide, and then your output image in the output resolution. You simply set these to the pass, set some constants, just fire the DLSS RR, make sure that executed before post-processing, and technically you're done. Sounds quite easy, kinda, right? Not quite. There's actually I guess I also lied to you a little bit. There's a few caveats and edge cases that you need to be aware of at least, depending on what you have in your engine. And these are the ones that I will talk next. So there's noise. There's, for example, ray tracing effects in quarter resolution or half resolution, what to do with that. We've partially solved that. Then there's subsurface scattering guide and other effects like that. That's kind of solved in this title. And then there's lots to talk about transparent surfaces. So let's talk about noise. And this is something very important that you need to pay attention with DLSS RR. So DLSS RR is really good at picking up fine details and emphasizing them in the final image. But that also means that if your noise has correlations, DLSS RR will pick up that and hallucinate because it thinks that's a feature that needs to be preserved. So basically there's two tips that I can give you. So make sure that your noise will not have correlations. Using white noise is a good idea actually. Blue noise could be used, but you just need to make sure that the sequence is long enough. And then this also applies to the effects. Make sure that you use white noise or long enough sequence noise in the effects that have some sort of sampling pattern so that they are not repeating, so that DLSS RR thinks that the sampling pattern is a pattern that needs to be shown in the final image. And if you have noise-related hallucinations, something like this could basically happen. Okay, let's move on. So let's talk about ray tracing effects in half and quarter resolution. So in the Star Wars Outlaws, with many of the ray tracing quality and resolution options, it is often the case that ray tracing passes are actually not in the full resolution. But DLSS RR really works the best with the full resolution noise. So what to do here? Of course, maybe first you would naively think that maybe we can just upscale the noisy image, but that's actually really bad. DLSS RR is not designed to work with blurry noise. Okay, so what else can we do? So maybe we can just simply trace lower number of samples. So that's what we did. And let's talk about that with examples. So here is just a reflection buffer. This is in full resolution, so all the pixels have some kind of information, so we're gonna use this as a reference. And here is it with RR denoising. looks nice. There's lots of detail on the water. Case face looks quite nice and soft. Looks good. But when we go lower resolution, so in this case, less samples in a stochastic manner, we simply stochastically randomly select pixels that we are going to trace or not trace. For example, in half resolution, just randomly select 50% of the pixels, and in quarter res, 25, and so on. And remember to multiply the radiance with 1 over probability, feed the image to the RR, and let's see what happens. So here's the noisy image again. Of course, you can probably spot that there's way less information, way more black pixels. That's fine. But how is it looks denoised? It is actually quite blurry. It generally looks fine, probably, but there's like lots of details lacking from the water. Case face is a bit red because that's like picked up with SSS. So can we do something better? And this is what we did. We simply identified some surfaces that need a bit more samples. We increased the probability. We, for example, identified that hair, eyes, water, and for example, skin would need a little bit more samples, so that's where we increased the probability. Then did the same again, feed it to RR. Let's see what happens. So here is with stochastic sampling without any increased probability. When we increase the probability, we get this. So obviously now there's more samples on the water, more samples on the skin, but not on every pixel. So let's see how this looks denoised. Oh, looks better. So there's still some blurriness on the water, but for example, case skin looks quite nice. So this is actually what we went with. It's still a little bit work in process, but it's amazing like how well RR can do when you don't even ray trace for every single pixel, and you actually ray tracing lower resolution, which is then upscaled. So this is quite cool. Okay, let's move on. Then let's talk about subsurface scattering. So I mentioned that this can probably be a problem depending on how it is implemented. The reason being that RR really doesn't like blurry noise. It's not designed to be working with that. And also subsurface scattering algorithms might use like repeating sampling patterns, so that needs to be fixed. So here's an example video how for example, skin looks when we don't do anything special for SSS. So there's some noise. I'm not sure how well you can see it. Okay, but there's actually two approaches that you can do. First one is to modify the subsurface scattering algorithm to make it more stochastic. So use white noise and then don't use MIB levels. Make sure that the sampling pattern is stochastic, good. And this is what we get. It's much better already. I don't think you can spot any noise on her face. But you know, this needs some algorithmic changes, so that's always a bit annoying, so we can actually do something else as well. So the approach 2 is to use subsurface scattering guide buffer. This doesn't need any changes to the subsurface scattering algorithm. So you simply save the color before SSS and then after SSS, do the after minus before, take the luminance of that and feed that as a subsurface guide to the RR. And this is what you get. Again, noise-free subsurface scattering. And here's some images. This is the noisy input, for example. Then the subsurface scattering guide buffer could look something like this. Obviously, negative values would be okay as well, but it's hard to show. And then the final image is nice and smooth. Okay, let's move on. Then let's talk about transparency. There would be a lot to talk about transparency, but I'll tell you a few things. So as you already might know, the guide buffers are mostly representing a one surface, but you often might have a case where you see technically two surfaces. There is the transparent surface and then the opaque surface. So which one are you going to use for the guide buffers? So ideally, when you have water or glass, something very clear, that's not necessarily going to need any denoising. So you could just ray trace the transparent reflections into a separate buffer and add it to the final lighting after DLSS RR, and that would be perfect. In case you have some particles, please render the particles into a separate guide buffer, which is called transparency layer, and just keep the opaque surface in the guide buffers. But actually, we didn't do neither of these. We just did our reflections in one go and did a few hacks here and there to make it work. So here's a reference image. Like, this is how the water should look like in this game. But when we first implemented things, it looked like this. Obviously, because we had the opaque surface, for example, in the normal maps, and there's some stones in the bottom of the river. So, but obviously you can see the water surface where the reflections are. So that's why DLSS RR thinks that the stones need to be kind of hallucinated on top of the water surface. So how to fix it? Well, we did something simple like this. So when we have water, we simply modify some of the guide buffers, such as normal maps, diffuse albedo, specular albedo. I guess you could do it so that you would use the Fresnel to figure out which surface needs to be where, but we just did something simple like this and it works well. Okay, then let's talk about actually something that doesn't work so well, but to be transparent, pun intended, here's the thing. So in this game, you can see lots of these transparent dittered layers. These are called force fields. And due to time constraints, we didn't have time to fix them properly. But these are pretty challenging for DLSS RR because we want to have them affecting the game's lighting. So that's why this red transparent surface is also rendered into the G buffer. And for example, these G buffers go into DLSS RR, and DLSS RR thinks that the dittered pattern on the transparent layer needs to be preserved, and that's why we might get some hallucinations here and there. But how you would actually solve something like this is simply, again, render them separately into a transparent layer, which is then given as a guide buffer for DLSS RR, and you would be good. Okay. Let's take a look at some amazing images. So this is maybe one of my favorite ones. Here's a noisy buffer, so no denoising of any sort. You can see there's like lots of detailed shadows from the tools. And when we denoise them without DLSS RR, this is what we get. So we lose quite a bit of shadow detail. And with DLSS RR, the shadows are there. Amazing. Let's take a look at another example where we have some movement. So Quentin was already showing this. Let's use it again. So noisy buffer, and then DLSS RR off. There's some movement, some noise under the wheel, which is solved with DLSS RR. Nice. And then another classic example, some of the stuff that we've been already showing. So, here's very nice, shiny surface with lots of detail on the ground. This is the noisy buffer. Then DLSS RR off. You can see that the emissive lights are a little bit blurred. Maybe some detail is a little bit lost. But when we enable DLSS RR, we get this. So detail is nicely preserved on the ground. The lights are all nice and crisp. And yep. One more example, then we're going to talk about performance very quickly. So here's an interesting case where we have mostly indirect lighting. So noisy buffer, I don't know if you're even able to spot the noise, but there is some noise that needs to be denoised. When we enable denoising, but no RR, this is what we get. It looks, fine, no noise, but maybe a little bit blurry. But when we enable DLSS RR, this is what we get. So, for example, facial features are more defined and fine shadows are there. Going just back and forth a little bit. Yep. Okay, let's quickly touch on the performance. This is just a regular case, 4K resolution, 4080. DLSS performance, RR off and RR on, graphics quality ultra, RTXDI ultra. So in this case, the ray tracing effects are not in full resolution. So basically, the true half or quarter resolution is a bit faster than our stochastic approach. But we still get a little bit performance benefits with RR because we don't need any denoising. And obviously, I guess you could already tell that the image quality benefits are there as well. Okay. Some conclusions. So initial implementation, again, super easy. Just put your guide buffers in. You already have the information in the G buffer most likely, and it kind of just works. Disable denoising, that's it. But there are these edge cases that you really need to care about. There's noise, you need to care about your transparent surfaces, whether those are water, glass, or particles. And then take care of your subsurface scattering effects or any kind of like translucent effects. But you know, the upside is that you get pretty amazing image quality. There's no any kind of settings that you need to tune. You just turn it on and that's it. And it simplifies the rendering pipeline. So, just to wrap up, both of these technologies are out there if you want to try. Both of you can find them from the GitHub. And I guess we're kind of done. There's a bunch of people that we want to thank because it wasn't only us who did the work. This was a true team effort. So thank you for all these people and maybe some others as well. And then it's time for questions. Please use the mic.
No question.
Good.
Either it was so clear or not interesting at all.
I did see that.
Hey.
Hey.
Nice presentation. I was wondering, how do you handle fog with ray reconstruction, and specifically fog that is completely stochastic and volumetric in the same rendering pass?
Luckily, it wasn't. So, okay, the question was that how would we handle fog if it's stochastic, basically. So, luckily, it wasn't a problem for this title. I guess this would require a longer discussion, but let's say that the stochastic fog, which would have maybe some noise, is potentially a little bit research question, to my knowledge. So, I won't go into details, but wasn't a problem for this title.
Thank you.
Right.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I was just wondering your approach to generating accurate motion vectors for items that you have to update on the GPU, like particles or just displaced surfaces or things that have to change between frames, because if the motion vectors aren't accurate, things can quickly fall apart.
So there was a question about motion vector accuracy. I guess generally motion vectors need to be accurate. I don't know what else to really say.
I guess I'm just wondering, like for like a skinned mesh, for example, where if you update the vertices on the GPU, do you have like a double buffered approach, or because I guess to need to render out the difference between the previous frame and the current frame. So I'm just wondering your approach to handling those scenarios.
Well, do you have something?
I'm afraid I don't know all the details for that part, but we do have accurate motion vector for mostly everything in the pipeline, except if something is buggy, but shouldn't be. But yeah, I don't know all the details on how we manage the skin, the meshes, motion vector exactly.
Okay, thank you.
My question is, why do we need to use white noise? Because white noise, I think there's more low frequency noise, right? And why DLSS need those low frequency noise to work?
So question was why white noise? It's not necessarily a like frequency of noise. It's simply that you need to have a noise which doesn't have correlations. So like usually, let's say, I guess before RR, in ray tracing effects, it was recommended to use some sort of blue noise, maybe with quite a short sequence, because that could be good for analytical denoisers, because then you kind of know where your samples are and they're nicely laid out and so on. But this is not true for RR, and simply because RR tries to pick up features, and if there's any kind of correlations, it doesn't like that. So technically the flavor of noise doesn't matter as long as it's like random enough.
Okay. Sequence means temporal sequence, right?
Temporal, spatial.
Oh, okay, temporal and spatial. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks so much.
Hi, great talk. Just in terms of the spatial samples that you would have for the neighbors for the RTX DI, did you have to tune that specifically, or was there a global setting?
So the question is about spatial resampling, the samples that we use for the neighbors. So I didn't talk about it, but it was on the slide when I talk about the spatial resampling. We have what we call this neighbor offset buffer that is created by RTX AI that will fill a neighbor with the buffer with offsets to where to sample things.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what we use when we do denoise with NRT. And yeah, there is some parameters that you can tune for like the size of your how far you take sample, but we are using the default parameters of RTX AI, and it worked well. In the case of when we use RR, we are not using the neighbor offset buffer, but we are using white noise as well.
Okay, got it. And in terms of temporal history, how long are you holding the information for?
I don't remember exactly. Again, this is something you can, there is an option to say how much you want, but we are using the default RTX AI parameters that worked well for us, but I don't remember exactly how long it is. But yeah, basically periodically it will reset to not carry that sample too long, especially like if you have, we are keeping the visibility information, and if the sample is old, we will retrace that visibility instead of reusing the visibility information that was stored like 16 frames ago or something like that. But I don't remember exactly the number of frames that we keep things around.
Thank you.
Hi, another question. Sorry. I guess I found in practice it can be quite easy to run into like artifacting with RT when you're especially when you're tracing against log levels that don't match with what you've rasterized. And I'm just wondering if you guys ran into those issues, or how you got around them, or if you just added some sort of offset or bias, or what approaches you guys took.
Yes. So the question is about issues with how the scene looks in rasterized view and in the retracing world. If there's issues with that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, as I said, like we did a lot of work to get our BVH up to par with what we get in the rasterized world. So the same kind of LODs and the same movement in the vertex when stuff are moving the vertex shaders. But as I said, we don't do update every frame, so there will be some inconsistency. Basically what we do is we start our ray tracing with a short screen space rate of 20 centimeters, if I recall correctly, and then we finish up with the ray tracing if we didn't collide anything with the screen space. So yeah, just using screen space to get away from the surface, and then we don't have issue of the BVH not being fully exact as the rasterized view.
Great, thank you.
Okay, then we will be hanging out somewhere around here. If you have any more questions, if you're too shy to come here, to come to the mic. Otherwise, thank you all for attending our talk, and I hope it was useful for all of you.